and on episode 46 of the Platform to Perform podcast, I'm delighted to welcome Will Wayland. How are you doing today, Will?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. We'll kick things off with the same question that I kick it off with everyone, and that is, why do you do what you do?
That's a good question. That's better than the question of tell us about yourself, because I hate being given that question over and over again. Because after you've introduced yourself once, that's enough. But anyway, basically facilitate education. I'm of the opinion that coaches are teachers, and one thing we're trying to do is teach, if it be strength and conditioning, if it be sport. What we're looking for at the end of the day is developing, competency and facilitating change that hopefully leads to performance gain at some point down the road. But the big thing is teaching competency and just teaching in general.
And I'm going to segue already. One of your articles I was reading in the week that I really enjoyed was talking about keeping athletes adaptable, and it makes sense given the current climate we're in. That you said it's sort of no point if the athletes don't know how to adapt their programs or their sessions themselves. So how do you go about doing that?
So occasionally, you'll because athletes are creatures of habit, and the athlete lifestyle, there's a comfort in it for many of them because it's a monotonous, predictable life. For a lot of athletes, it's the same thing week in, week out, and the security in that. And a lot of people would like that. They like feeling safe. They like feeling secure. They know what's coming over the hill. There's a predictability to that way of doing things. And what I discuss is, especially with a lot of the athletes I work with who travel an awful lot, they're constantly throwing curveballs and having to adapt their training program very, very regularly. And some people can't handle it, and they just throw up their hands and walk away. And what part of my job is to build resiliency into these guys so that if a curveball is thrown at them, they can adapt and make the necessary changes they need to their programming or their lifestyle or whatever. COVID's been the biggest spanner in the works I think you could ever hope to see. And a lot of guys have had to adapt, turning living rooms into gyms, outdoor spaces into gyms, buying what gym equipment they can, and then trying to work based on what they've got around them, and for some it was easy because they're obviously sort of mentally very flexible, whereas other people, find it very, very tough. For instance, I know a few people in the powerlifting community who found it incredibly tough because suddenly their weapon of choice was taken away from them, and they're scrambling to adapt. And the part of the few powerlifting community we have at our facility, part of their education has been learning to handle, training and not worrying so much about the loss of strength, because you sort of remind them that fundamentally it's pretty easy got back, provided they were competent in the first place. It's the gen pop people that train in our facility are the ones that are sort of reeling because I know some of them haven't done anything during lockdown, so it's going to be harder for them to reestablish themselves once they come back. 9 months of nothing, but hey, if they've done some training before, it's not so bad.
Yeah, it's ironic because again, I feel massively for gym owners and desperate to get back to the gym myself. But it's funny on that, not to criticize general population, but when they're like, oh yeah, gyms are currently shut here in the UK, and it's almost like, oh, what do we do? It's like, there are other choices that don't involve going to a gym.
Exactly.
Although I'd much prefer to be there as well. So you work with people pretty much, well, from the outside looking in, on opposite ends of the spectrum in golf and professional boxing, mixed martial arts. How on earth do you fall into that?
Yeah, so I frequently joke that if you're an athlete that doesn't have to run, I'm your guy. If you want to hit people really hard or hit things really hard, I'm probably useful to have. Whereas like you want to learn front side mechanics, don't come to me. I'm not a sprint guy. So that's kind of how I've wound up in this niche of working with basically, I guess, rotational power athletes, for lack of a better term. So I'd probably plonk combat athletes in that as well. And yeah, it's just fortuitous that a lot of the stuff, because I worked with MMA first, and then a lot of the stuff I learned in MMA transferred pretty well into golf strength and conditioning as well. So the two things kind of work together pretty well. And it's thus far it's been a pretty good sort of but slightly strange path for me. So yeah.
And in terms of assessing rotational athletes, whether it's an M&A guy, a golf chap, what does that assessment process look like for you?
So everything starts with their relationship with the ground. It's very important that we assess their ability to produce force, and both their ability to produce force very rapidly. So the two tests we use for both sort of fundamental strength and conditioning tests of isometric mid-thigh pull, counter movement jump impulse. And those both look the same for MMA fighters and for the golfers. And the UFC PI use the mid-thigh pull. They use counter movement jump impulse. We at the European Tour Performance Institute use mid-thigh pull and counter movement jump impulse, because these are measures of general athleticism. And we know that MMA fighters benefit from improved low body strength. We know that golfers benefit from improved low body strength. So those are the commonalities. And I guess this is why I'm able to work with both sets of athletes without too much trouble.
And with your, just touching on the golf side of things for a second, I remember listening to an Eric Cressy podcast where he cited a bit of research that showed that some of his baseball guys had really poor correlations between stuff like a counter movement jump and a rotational power. So, for example, I don't know, a rotational hop, rotational med ball throw. Do you think there's any, or what do you hypothesize as being the reasons why some guys benefit massively from just building up general strength and power in the sagittal plane, and other guys it doesn't seem to transfer so well? Again, I appreciate that's a huge generalization.
Yeah, the golf would be contrary. All the research we've got, all the evidence we've got, and obviously there's always going to be outliers,
of course.
But the study we did with challenge tour players, and a lot of the evidence shows that low body strength has strong correlation to club head speed and ball speed. 0.8 confidence, and which is pretty damn good. And thus far, pretty much every golfer I've made stronger, in the low body, their ball speed and club head speed improve in some degree. Not saying every massive improvements for everyone, but we always generally see general improvements. And this is because as a population, golfers are generally more undertrained than, say, your typical pro baseball player. And this is why golfers always seem to make gains when we perform almost very basic strength and conditioning interventions. With high-level baseball guys, I can't speak to what Eric Cressy's been doing, but you might be scraping the barrel there. It might be that their low body strength is already pretty good, and they're not going to get much more out of getting stronger. Without seeing the information, I can't say, but that's what we see in golf. So all the evidence suggests that low body strength is a strong correlate to club head speed and ball speed.
And what are some of the mistakes that you see when it comes to golf, the golf population's view on strength and conditioning?
So golf has been pulled kicking and screaming into the 21st century, because golf at its core is a culture. You got to remember that golf is different to a lot of other sports. A lot of people play golf as a recreational game. So the distance between recreational golfers and the professional golfers as a population, they don't see the difference is that enormous. And there's this dissonance among high-level amateur players that they just need to practice more golf to get to the professional level. But what we're seeing now, particularly with the whole distance argument in golf, which is causing a lot of consternation, because suddenly distances have gotten a little bit, not in real terms, they've not actually got that much longer, but there are a few players who are very good outliers who are hitting it a lot further than everybody else, and also winning. And yeah, it's just this odd situation that there's an unwillingness to accept that perhaps being physical and being strong may be a part of that equation. And it's interesting because the technical primacy in golf is so important that it's almost as if nothing else matters. So, but now the opinions are changing. Well, what happens when everybody achieves a high level of technical expertise? Well, there's an exploitable there, and that exploitable is physicality, and that, you know, and now guys like Bryson DeChambeau, wait a minute, there's space here to grow, and they're exploiting those opportunities and getting stronger, getting heavier, you know, gaining body mass, and it's making a difference. It's making a difference, and we know that strength and body mass are, again, good correlates to club head speed and ball speed. But we saw the same thing, sure, in martial arts years ago. I see it in the Brazilian jiu-jitsu community. You know, I've been doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu for 10 years, and I remember starting out, a lot of the diehard old school Brazilian jiu-jitsu guys were like, oh, you know, jiu-jitsu is about technique and overcoming the stronger, bigger opponent. You know, you look at the lineup at the ADCC, which is like the world championship of submission grappling. These guys are all jacked out of their minds, you know, and so you can't say that being physical and strong doesn't have some sort of performance impact. You know, when everybody's really, really good, you know, particularly in a sport like submission grappling, being that little bit stronger than your opponent might make all the difference, you know. But in golf, obviously, it's still a super technical, tactical sport, but being stronger, being more physical, gives you extra tactical options, because, you know, you, instead of taking 2 shots, you can try and take that 1 shot. It might be risky, but if you're further along the green, then you're winning, you know.
I think it was a conference I attended with Sophia Nymphius, who's basically a change of direction keynote speaker in the strength and conditioning world, and she was talking about physical qualities versus technical qualities in the skill of change of direction. And she's like, ultimately, yet strength is important, and obviously technique's important, but you can't use strength that you don't have. And I'm kind of think it's kind of the same with golf, in the sense of, we're not saying that the power lifter is the person with the biggest drive, but equally, you know, if you've got no strength, then you're probably going to break at some point. Yeah,
and the thing is, I've said before that the part of the problem is golfers have always put when it comes to embracing strength and conditioning, they grab specificity with both hands and think that everything has to be geared towards specific outcomes, without respecting general physicality and the second order, third order benefits this stuff brings. They don't see that stuff. They want it to have an immediate performance outcome. And what happens is it ends up having no performance outcome, because a lot of these guys are giving special methods, special exercises, but they're not objectively measuring outcomes. And then what you end up with is you know, stuff on Bosu balls, you know, specific looking drills with cable machines. You can always spot the golfer in the gym. You know, you Google or look up a hashtag of golf fitness, you're in for a fun time, because there's some interesting interpretations of what specificity for those guys should be. And yeah, and I think on the part of the golf coach, and I think the TPI might, you know, I don't know if you've heard of this organization, but they have a huge amount of influence on golf fitness and what that looks like. And for the longest time, we were seeing guys hanging out on the FMS screen and TPI screen and using that corrections within that. And I think a lot of, perhaps not TPI's original intention, but people were using that as a, well, here's the means to improve physicality for golf. And you know, and now we're seeing a sort of a shift. More guys are now interested in conventional barbell training, but again, because they've started ass backwards, they're trying to learn fundamentals, you know, quite late on. So it's harder, say, rather than, you know, doing your typical long-term athletic development, picking up all the basics in your late teenage years and early 20s, and then, you know, cruising throughout your 20s and 30s. What we're doing now is we're teaching 30-year-olds, you know, sometimes older, the basics of strength and conditioning interventions, you know. But we've got a good situation in England, for instance. Golf is going to be interesting in the next 10 years, because all the juniors, all the guys in the England regional squad, all the guys in part of England golf are all mastering those basics now. So golf will be in an interesting place. Whereas before, there was never any interest in that type of stuff. But what's happening is NGBs are driving the change. Some NGBs are better than others, but yeah, NGBs are driving the change in golf when it comes to embracing strength and conditioning.
And just to touch upon a couple of things you mentioned there, because transfer training specificity is a topic that really gets my juices going. But just for the listeners, could you explain what you mean by second order effects and third order effects?
Sure. So let's use an example. Let's take one people should know, the back squat. So what's the primary function of the back squat? To increase weight on the bar, right? If I'm a powerlifter, or if my main focus is getting stronger, the weight goes up. So the interpretation here is that I'm stronger. That's fine. But there are benefits to doing this that are perhaps more implicit and less explicit. And these range from, well, if I'm stronger, I'm potentially more robust. I can tolerate more stress. I can tolerate more load in other activities potentially, which is why, for instance, people hate the studies, but there's great evidence by Gregory Half and guys like that showing that, and this is the number everyone dislikes. For some reason, double body weight back squat seems to exist as a number that suggests that if people achieve that, they're injured less. Now, there's a lot in that mix, but that would be a second order benefit. Third order benefit would be something very peripheral. For instance, I don't know, back squatting, because let's say if I get good at doing heavy singles, there's an intensity and an intent that comes with that perhaps then can proliferate into other aspects of my life, and that would be a third or even fourth order benefit, stuff that's not really the aim of training, but it's something that comes as a benefit of training. Mental well-being, for instance, a lot of people pay lip service to mental health. Well, you know what, doing a heavy back squat and getting a new PR or something, I walk out of the gym and I'm the boss. I feel really, really good about myself. Well, that's not the stated aim of training. That's not what I'm there to do, but I feel good as a result of that. So that would be a tertiary benefit that's perhaps not the stated aim of just getting stronger, putting more weight on the bar, right? So this is what we mean by second and third order benefits or effects.
Yeah, and it's funny because I was speaking to a previous podcast, Jeffrey Chu, last night about just making sure I had in my head the terminology you were using and some terminology that I've been using. But I was thinking when you get to a point where, and again, you mentioned the 2 times body weight back squat. Another thing that strength and conditioning coaches love talking about is being quote unquote strong enough. And in my head, I was thinking, right, when you are whatever that strong enough figure is, does it then get relegated to something like, I don't know, a confidence booster, or I don't know, just psychologically getting the athlete in the right place? You also mentioned the FMS screens and the TPI screens. What is your general opinion on those for golf? And if you're not a fan, then what would you suggest as an alternative?
So you got to remember this. I came to golf as an outsider, and I came from a combat sport. So I looked around at the golf landscape. I did my due diligence when I got started with golf, and I looked at what everybody else was doing, what the thinking is, what the rationale is behind that stuff. And I guess the biggest problem with the TPI stuff is this. They make a lot of bold statements, but they do not evidence their statements past anecdotes or N1 outcomes. They're not really willing to have the outcomes of their approach put under a microscope. Now, because they're kind of adjacent with the FMS stuff, there's a study just this last week, I think, that showed that FMS scores, again, aren't particularly great predictors, and that if people know the tests, they can cheat the tests, which was the study, I think, from this week that came out. So that questions the relevance of that type of testing. So what I kind of do now is I implicitly screen my guys via warm up and watching tape and movement. So I guess the job of coaching, believe it or not, without having a handy screen to use as reference, what we go back to is a more organic sort of mental model of like using heuristics and something a lot more personal, a lot more flexible. We have a screen we use at our gym, but it's a general physical assessment. We don't sell it as a golf assessment, and that's where our physios do a once over on everyone and make sure that sort of everything moves well. But we give it enough plasticity that we can mold it to around the individual. So we're not shackled by strict, criteria. And we found that sort of, slightly looser model works better than having strict screens. For instance, I've had guys who playing on the European tour, some of the best golfers in the world with club head speeds of sort of 130 mile per hour plus. they're failing they're failing TPI screens, but these guys are performing at the highest level. Now, the implication from TPI is that if they were to master get better at the test of the screens, their golf would somehow improve. That's the implication. They don't say that explicitly, but that's what they've always implied. And I guess this is part of the problem with this stuff is the lack of objective measures. If you believe in your method, open it up, let people test it, let them do the research on it, or do your own research, either negative or positive, and be open about it. But if you're trying to sell something, however, you don't show your hand, because I'm guessing I'm implying now that perhaps they don't actually believe in their outcomes. If you're open and transparent and want to sell more, you get it verified, and then if the evidence backs you up, you probably sell more of your screens and programs and courses. You know what I'm saying?
And then on the flip side, when you realize that all of a sudden what you were anecdotally promising doesn't deliver, it could be disastrous.
Well, this is the risk, right? This is the risk, and this is why golf for a long time, particularly from a physical training standpoint, was not being objective enough. Which is why, the guys who came ahead of me at the European Tour Performance Institute, they said, right, we need to mid-thigh pull, and we need to counter movement jump impulse, do some rotational testing and objective neck testing that has existed in sports for decades, and bring it to golf. So we actually know that our interventions are making a difference. And now, because more guys are interested in club head speed and ball speed, I'm picking up clients because I said, right, what's your club head speed, ball speed? And don't get me wrong, I'm a private S&C coach. So I am trying to beat my competition. I want people to train with me and not with other people. Now, I'm not the type of guy to throw other people's coaches under the bus, but what I will say is, right, you've been with this guy for 2 years, your club head speed is what? And they'll give me a number. I go, right, the 2-3 years you've been training with this person, has it improved? And they're like, no. And it's like, well, how can you be sure the intervention you were doing was making any meaningful performance impact? And it's a hard question. And a lot of these guys scratch their heads and they're like, oh, bollocks, I might have wasted 3 years of training, not making any real headway. Yeah, don't get me wrong, if you're less injured, that's also good, but in terms of like objective performance impacts, you've got to be honest with yourself. And this is where golfers differ from other athletes, I guess. Perhaps MMA fighters are the same, but they're fiercely loyal to the coaches around them, and they aren't willing to make staff changes when needed, because you got to remember each golfer is basically his own, to some extent, acts as his own performance manager, and he's responsible for picking and choosing the people around him. Which is funny because they'll stay loyal to a physio or a golf coach or an S&C coach or a golf fitness coach for a very long time, but they'll drop and pick up caddies on the day. So they'll they fire them on the first hole. Which is why it always strikes me as funny, because they're so willing to turn over caddies, but they're unwilling to sort of rearrange the other backroom stuff.
Yeah, and just in listening to you speak there, I was just thinking about, as you said, people who don't measure performance. Do you think this is something I wanted to talk about later on in the podcast, but seems like an appropriate segue? Do you think that's a classic case of reals versus feels? Like, oh, I feel like I'm performing better. It's like, yes, but are you? Yeah,
actually the golf world hangs out on this terminology an awful lot, that feel doesn't equal real and so on. And they love the talk of it, because quite often, I guess with the execution of the golf swing, sometimes it feels odd, but the swing is really, really good. And then there's talk about when feel and real come together and all this stuff. And it's just like very nebulous relative coaching terminology. And it's like, well, you have to ask them, well, what do you mean? Are you being objective? Because if you can get the objective measures to line up with the subjective feel of how everything's occurring, then you're onto a winner, I guess. And that's the trick, is if you can get those things to conjoin and come together, then you're good, and I guess it's also having faith in regular objective performance testing. And I think that's what golf for a large part is lacking. It's changing now. Now more guys are interested in club head speed and ball speed measures, a lot of them taking TrackMans and other measuring tools with them, so they can keep constantly measuring their club head speed throughout the season. And we've done a lot of that as well, just measuring objective golf performance, because at the end of the day, that's the thing that matters most. What's your club head speed? What's your ball speed? We'll do it with a different number of clubs and just keep those measures ticking along over the course of a year, and feed into what we think might improve or help maintain those scores.
Do you ever have, in terms of club head speed, obviously if they're under, for example, depending on the stage of the season, if they're under a lot of training stress, then, and depending where they are in their golf season, is there ever a point where, for example, it goes down and you've got to educate them and say, look, this isn't going down longer term? Or, for example, is it a case of, if it goes down, this is shit, what the hell have we been doing?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They go down all the time. It's like trying to. I always liken it to when you put your foot on the accelerator and you go flat out, and the needle, goes to 100 miles an hour or whatever, and it doesn't stay there, right? It flutters. And if you're hitting peak performance and maintaining, a good in-season training regimen, you'll see that natural fluctuation in your club head speed. Because it's quite sensitive to neural fatigue, is the other thing we've found. And then over the course of the season, because the season's quite rigorous, and people don't appreciate this in golf. For instance, we measure their body weight and their club head speed over the course of a season. I've had guys lose, like 4 to 5 kilos over a season, because generally they're traveling a lot and the food is bad. And their club head speed will drop subsequently as well. We'll often see losses of up to 5, even up to 10 miles per hour over the course of a really long season. And it's because, it's hard work, disrupted sleep schedules, inconsistent training, all that type of stuff basically starts to bleed the athlete a little bit as they progress through the course of the season, which is why if you're an amateur or sort of middle level golfer, you'll play every event you've got available to you. When you're at the very highest level, you have the luxury of kind of choosing a little bit of what events you want to do. You can take weeks off to try and recover and rebuild. And then the other time we see club head speed kind of drop is when we do our off-season intervention. Quite often during the heaviest training cycles, particularly if I'm using a lot of eccentric or isometric stimulus, we'll see a drop in club head speed. And that's just because of general fatigue and very high levels of allostatic stress or whatever. So, but then what we see is a subsequent supercompensation, and the club head speed comes back up higher, hopefully, if we've done everything right.
And without revealing all of your secrets, so you mentioned about your big hitters manual with Terence Kernel. So if club head speed is really sensitive to fatigue, then what might a sort of, I suppose, a weekly template or a weekly overview look like for a golfer trying to improve this then?
Yeah, so in that manual, we outline like a basic 3-day week strength plan. With plenty of med ball work, and a lot of fundamentals, really, because the big hitters manual was aimed at sort of college age or high school age athletes. It's kind of a more of an introductory to sort of a general well-rounded strength training routine. And most of the time we encourage people to measure their club head speed as often as possible, because it's aimed at the sort of lower level guys. They maybe don't have as much access, but thus far, everyone that's gone in measured their club head speed before they started that program, and it's only an 8-week intervention. They come out the other side and have usually gained a couple of miles per hour more. And again, going back to what I said earlier, this is generally because most golfers are pretty pretty undertrained. So at that point, any well-rounded, sensible intervention is going to make a little bit of difference.
And so are they doing in terms of measuring their club head speed, and in terms of, for example, 3 days a week, that's just 3 days a week, presumably separate days with just bit of strength stuff, bit of power stuff, and nothing too complicated?
No, so the way we've organized it is initially the first 4 weeks are more force oriented, and then the back 4 weeks are more power oriented, and that's largely an issue of just basically because, again, this program is aimed at lower level guys, is basically just lightening the load a little bit and focusing more on intent based focus. And then the med ball work shifts from, say, extensive med ball work to more intensive med ball work. which is probably the number one question I get about that manual is what do you mean extensive versus intensive med ball work? So there's a bit of a glossary at the end where we explain what that is, and basically it means higher volumes for higher for sort of moderate effort, and then intensive is very high output but very, very low volumes. So for instance, this as simply as I can put it, let's say sort of sets of 10 of med ball throws with a ball that bounces back off the wall, so you can get high turnover, and then perhaps the back 4 weeks a med ball throw where you're doing something intensive, either a single med ball throw very hard against the wall, as hard as you possibly can, resting a moment, picking it up, do it again. So that's the difference between the two. Very, very basically put. But yeah, a lot of people would get confused between extensive and intensive drills. Intensive drills are all about low volume, high output. Extensive drills are sort of moderate output, quite high volume. And yeah, so that's sort of how that works.
So you'd almost want, I mean, if you've got a choice, you're using your, to be really, really pernickety, using med balls in the extensive phase, but then maybe, as an example, slam balls in the intensive phase, just by nature that you're going to have to pick the thing up and
yes, yeah. That's actually the difference we do use. So we'll use our lighter rubber air-filled med balls for the extensive work, and then we use the slam balls, the ones filled with sand or whatever, or even bean bags work pretty well for the intensive stuff. And it's just getting athletes, and that's the biggest thing with golfers, I think, and with the fighters too, is with your intensive work, is to get them to put, use that first part of that word, intent, maximum intent into every single throw. Do not half-ass it. And this is one thing I sort of saw in, boxing is a great example of sort of half-ass med ball work done for very high volumes and very high reps. And when every time I've worked with a boxer or a striker, we've seen improvements merely from switching that up and going, right, we're not going to do tons and tons and tons of high rep med ball work. We're going to do intensive, high quality med ball throws where we focus on you trying to throw that thing as hard as you can. And we see improvements from just that simple switch.
Yeah, boxing's definitely one of those sports that just culturally loves to, I mean, I call it the sort of middleman of conditioning. Like the work it's hard, but it's not maximal. And it's like, well, there's too much recovery cost here, but we're not really raising the ceiling much.
Yeah, there's a saying I use that medium is the highway to mediocrity. So it's just, I see a lot of that, and like you're basically handicapping guys. It's like you're clipping their wins, so to speak, from a force expression standpoint, because you're just giving them a bunch of middle ground, nothing work that's a grind, and it kind of sucks. And I think it perhaps hobbles a lot of potential athletes who could be hitting harder, could be being more powerful, but you've switched it up, in an effort to fatigue them, quite often under the guise of building mental toughness or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and that's a whole different rabbit hole in itself. But like you said, I mean, it's something that I've done video content about, in terms of, like, a boxer might say, oh, what's a good circuit? And you're like, right, how far back do I have to strip this before you actually get a solid concrete answer? It's like, what are med balls good for? And you're like, well, it depends, but the way you're using them, probably not that.
Well, this is where with a lot of boxers, I've used potentiation clusters in the past, where we'll have them, it's not a circuit per se, but it's like a marriage of French contrast and cluster work, and we'll have them go from a single squat to a med ball throw to to like a jump squat or something, to a box squat or box jump, and we'll cycle these movements as singles and do them in a cluster fashion. That way they kind of feel like they're doing a circuit, but they're not. What they're actually doing is a cluster circuit. And everything's very qualitative, but they like it because it means they're going from one thing to another, and it taps into that sort of element of stuff they've done in the past. So the potentiation clusters work well, and we use that with combat, our MMA fighters and stuff too. So because they get that circuit type efforts going from one thing to another thing to another thing, but everything basically serves a higher aim of better quality outputs.
Sounds very similar to something they used to do at GB Boxing whilst I was there. And basically, when the bigger, well, as you said with golf, for the lesser fights, you basically be able to look, you just train through it. It's not that important. But for the bigger ones, they'd basically do what to the outsider looking in would just be a circuit, but it was all high quality jumps, throws, make it really competitive, get a tendo unit on the bar, and psychologically the boxers would love it because it wasn't that sort of grindy strength type stimulus that they've been presented with weeks prior. And they just leave feeling really fresh, even though the irony being that they've just done some really high output type of work.
Yeah, I found that approach is really good for combat athletes. And again, because everything else they do is such a grind, particularly the sparring and the drilling and all that type of stuff. If you can take them into an S&C session, put them through some work, and they walk out feeling buzzed, then that's good. You're not adding to the crush, which is what happens with, in the olden days of S&C, and I was probably guilty of it as well, was just adding to that crush of all the different competing stresses. And now it's if you can keep it sort of approach it with brevity, think about the whole idea of via negativa, doing more with less, and that's the way sort of combat sports S&C has changed for me, is that I'm doing a lot less, but we're getting out a lot more.
And speaking of that, again, this might sound a little bit paradoxical when I try and explain it, but something that you mentioned in one of your articles that I really loved was, instead of doing a sort of traditional 8 to 12 week training camp, you're talking about building training residuals throughout the year so you can actually get more out of that official 8 to 12 week training camp. Do you want to talk about the thought process that's led you to that?
Sure. So that basically was a situation where I was working with a lot of guys who were sort of, I guess, intermediate level. When you're in the UFC, you have the luxury of having a lot more time. Prior to getting into the UFC, you're taking fights at short notice. You're having opponents pull out. It's a lot more unpredictable. It's a lot less stable. So this is where you start to develop sort of agile approaches. And what I started doing was, right, if we can establish good training residuals, and I think that having high levels of isometric and eccentric strength are really important for combat athletes, because it helps build their robustness. And what we do is we spike eccentric and isometric strength semi-regularly with supramaximal methods, sort of quite intensive, very low volume stresses that would then allow us to then, if we do get that demand for a fight, we can then peak almost immediately, because the strength and low tolerance that they're built from doing these very intensive, very high quality methods gives us a great base upon which to build. And thus far, I've not had too many fighters who've been seriously hurt, apart from problems that have occurred. Collision sport, combat sport, people are going to get joints hurt and stuff, but we've had no in-camp pullouts, which is quite a common problem. In MMA, it ruins fight shows where guys will pull out, with 1 or 2 weeks out, and this is generally because the training load is so lopsided, so spiked towards just before the fight. These guys break. Whereas what I'm doing is I'm giving them the most intensive strength training stimulus as far away from fight time as possible. And then what we allow to happen is, well, I kind of step off once camp starts, and the conditioning we do, is minimally invasive, minimally voluminous, but quite high intensity. And what happens is when we get to fight, everything's in the sparring. That's what matters, is the technical, tactical preparation. We've done the work well out of camp that will help them with their strength and robustness in the fight, hopefully. And that's kind of the approach to that, what we call compressed triphasic approach to MMA. So that's what I've been using, and you can use that, because you can maybe do anywhere from sort of 2 to 4 weeks of compressed training, and then you've got a grace period of up to sort of 12 weeks where you probably don't need to do it again. You only need to maybe do it 2-3 times a year. with that compressed stuff. And this is based off what Cal Dietz, the guy who kind of pushed the method's recommendations. And yeah, we use that compressed method a fair bit. And the fighters kind of they hate it, but they definitely feel the benefits.
Just in listening to you speak there, in terms of training residuals, then could you just explain for people who haven't come across this term before? And my second follow-up question for that is just something I'm interested to know: is the training residual of eccentric or isometric strength longer than just what your traditional lifts would be in the gym?
So in short, yeah, we've actually got some good evidence showing that the training residual, say for supramaximal eccentrics, might be roughly 3 months. And yeah, which is a pretty long time. And there's been really good research done on supramaximal eccentric work. And I think because it is such an outside stressor, it kind of then has that long second order bleed into everything else you do. But I think the key is you have to keep spiking it, say 2-3 times a year to keep that quality ticking over. And don't get me wrong, there's a minimum entry requirement. Like, I'm not going to let guys who are new be doing that type of training because it requires a certain level of competence. We might go back to that double body weight back squat number, but it does require a certain level of competence and confidence in the coach as well, because it's hard work. It's a hard method. It requires 2 spotters, and it requires coaching on how to do like the hand supported split squat or the hand supported squat, or how to do a proper supramaximal RDL. Like these methods are what we're using, or how to use weight releases, for instance. So there's a technical overhead that has to be hit before you can start implementing supramaximal stuff. But in terms of training residuals, it's how long the training effects last over a period of time once that particular stimulus, there's a cessation of that particular stimulus. So once you've stopped using that particular approach, how long do the benefits last for? And it's funny, a study dropped just today or yesterday showing basically minimal intervention for maintaining strength and fitness levels. That was in Gen Pop, but because COVID's have everybody reeling, going, oh my God, I'm going to lose on my gains. Well, it actually looks like residuals are perhaps longer than we think. And the intervention we need, I think that's from the study I was reading this morning, it was a single set of exercise at an appropriate intensity once a week is enough to maintain strength gains. And it's like, well, that changes everything, particularly for in-season approach. Now, obviously, because the in-season, you've got other demands, that you've got to try and stave off the competition of, but you might need to do a little bit more. But yeah, that's a good suggestion that 1 to 2 times a week of a single set, that sounds pretty good to most people. So to not lose too much of your strength, and hopefully if you've got a home gym set up or whatever, you can still do a little bit. So by residuals, it's how long a training effect lasts once it's been. And everyone breaks out this same chart that I see from Prelipin. I think it was Prelipin showing you the wiggle room from residuals. And well, I think what it's showing is, particularly with everything that's going on, some of those residuals last a lot longer than we ever thought. Yes, they might not be optimum, but in terms of keeping a level of tolerance of those training residuals, there's now increasing research showing that perhaps they last a lot longer than we ever thought they did.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things spring to mind. I remember having a lecture on one of my masters, and the phrase they used was soon ripe, soon rotten, in the sense of if you literally spent 2 weeks building strength, you can kiss goodbye to that pretty quickly. But for myself, as an example, been lifting 5-6 years, and I'm sure you've been lifting a lot longer than that. I still have this negative thing in the back of my head being like, well, your strength's going. You're like, hang on a minute, it's been built for about 5-6 years. It's not going to disappear overnight.
Well, this is something like I love Dan John's books, and something he talks about was how I think it was how the Soviets would take a month off a year, and then his heuristic I think is for every week you have off, that's a session you'll have to do to get back to where you were, and and funny enough, I made sure that I take a month off training almost completely, at least every year. I'll spread that out. Usually 2 weeks off at Christmas, and then 2 weeks I don't do any training during the summer. And this isn't including deload periods or anything. But the sometimes it's mentally freeing just to have 2 weeks where you don't have to go to the gym. You don't have that compulsion. You don't have to, you're not, because a lot of people end up, particularly recreational trainees and powerlifters, for instance, you're almost, you don't become your own person. You're a slave to your workout, right? And people perhaps don't see it that way because it's a compulsion. But it's like, perhaps just spend a week where you don't have to go, and don't get me wrong. This is weird because it speaks to a tiny minority of people, but I do see them day in, day out. Because obviously my gym is an enthusiast gym, where we get a lot of powerlifters, a lot of Olympic weightlifters. Don't get me wrong, we've got a problem where enough people don't exercise, but the people who do quite often do perhaps too much.
Yeah, I've definitely been guilty of being married to training, for an example, for want of a better word, and thinking, for example, if the program's set up in a certain way, oh God, but I've missed this day, and now what am I going to do? Whereas now it's just like, right, here's my sessions, here's an ideal order, here's a sort of not ideal, but better than doing nothing order. And you know what, if there's not a competition coming up and I don't know, this exercise gets substituted for this one, as long as the adaptation's the same, it's really not as important as I probably once thought it was.
Yeah. Well, this is something I've thought about more as I've gotten older. I'm going to be rapidly approaching 40, which means I can't train quite how I used to. And what I've started doing in the past 5 years is I'll go from periods of very structured training, say 3 months of very, very structured training, and then I'll do 3 months of far less structured training. It all serves the same broad aim, which is to be strong and robust and be able to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But I feel that trying to do everything in a very, very structured, ordered fashion all the time is mentally exhausting. And something Dan John refers to is park bench versus bus bench workouts. And the bus bench workout, or training period is where everything's on time, it's planned, it's structured, what's going to happen. And then the bus bench, the park bench workout is you're there at your leisure. You're doing things you enjoy. You're taking your time. You're under no obligation to be doing anything. And I found that flowing from those over, say, 12 to 16 week periods. So for instance, I finished a whole weight releaser cycle. I don't want to look at another weight releaser for at least 12 weeks, So after doing all this weight releaser work and then supramaximal stuff, like I feel it in myself that I need some time now. 12 weeks, I'm going to do very unstructured training, a lot of whatever I feel like, But because I've been lifting and doing this now for nearly 20 years, I have a level of competence that I can break out and do what I feel like more and more. Whereas perhaps when I was 18, 19, I needed to stick very fiercely to those fundamentals and those basics. You have to earn an abstraction. You don't get to do that from the get-go. And this is what we see, with a lot of I guess fitness, and particularly younger generation, is the willingness to engage in abstraction early on. It sort of you end up shortcutting yourself, whereas if you do engage in fundamentals early and stick to those and adhere to those, you earn the right to then play that little bit more later on. We see this in sport as well. You get the basic fundamentals down, then you can explore later on. And the same is true for lifting, so, we're not getting into Joel Seedman territory, but you'll occasionally see me toy with lifts that are sort of novel or different. So, if I want to try a cycle of staggered trap bar deadlifts, I can. If I want to try, perhaps doing, snatch grip dead RDLs for a while instead of, conventional grip RDLs. If I fancy doing some Zercher work, if I fancy doing some, novel med ball work or perhaps some different contrast work, I can play with that stuff. And this is the thing. And I posted about this recently, eating in your own restaurant and just embodying the virtues you espouse and experimenting and tinkering, which is important to sort of personal and professional development. So that kind of all ties in.
There's a couple of things that I've just resonated highly with what you've said there. And I hope people don't miss the nuance in what you just said. I was watching a Brett Contreras video the other day, and somebody asked him about programming. And he said, look, I basically wing it. But he's like, the fact is I've been doing this for 20 years. So my wing it is probably better than, you know, your wing it or whatever. But yeah, it's funny because that theme has come up in a few podcasts. I mean, myself, I'm currently doing Dan John's Even Easier Strength, because I'm like, if I can't commit to 2 sets of 5 with the equipment I've got available, then I can't commit to anything. It's more, right, this is going to give me some structure, but it's not going to be overbearing. And even then, playing about with some gymnastics rings once a week, just messing around with working towards a 1-arm chin up. And I've been training that once a week and still been progressing quite nicely. And to be honest, I've just been using that as a bit of fun rather than, oh, let's test minimal dose training. But it seems to be working. GB Judo also have, I remember listening to, I think it's Alan McDonald, and he was talking about this 2 times bodyweight back squat. And he said in his head, he'd rather get someone, if once they've got this 2 times bodyweight back squat, he'd rather see how many different ways they can perform a 2 times bodyweight back squat rather than go from 2 to say 2.5 as an example. But yeah, for me, especially with combining calisthenics, powerlifting, like the more strength you've got, the more you can play with it. And to be honest, I remember asking my powerlifting coach, I was, oh, why are we doing this variation? What part of my lift's that going to help with? And he's like, it's literally just something different. Like, don't think that this is the magical variation that you've been missing. That's the key to all your lifts. It's literally just, we're switching it up so you become desensitized to stuff we might use later on.
Yeah, and this speaks to another approach that I took from Mladen Jovanovic in the everyday maximum approach, and I guess it's partly inspired by sort of some of the Bulgarian method, which is sort of work to a heavy single every single day. I guess it's slightly different in the with the EDM approach or everyday max that I use. It's a good way to spike training intensity in season. So you work up to a heavy single, but it's with a max that you can do any day of the week. No hype, no back slapping, no triple espresso, nothing like that. And you perform that lift, and then what I'll do is quite often prescribe back offsets as at a percentage of that daily EDM, and we'll use that to help spike training load, because it helps athletes feel stronger, which is the other thing. And we'll use that quite often if they've been on a little bit of a break, and they want to come back, but they don't fancy conventional sort of GPP cycle. They want to do a little bit of heavy lifting, so we'll come and have them come in and do that. I posted 2 methods on Twitter and Instagram just yesterday that we use, where we sort of do an EDM lift at the start of a session, then a lot of GPP work, or we'll pick a couple of lifts, an EDM each one for that day, and then do a couple of subsequent back offsets. Just stuff like that. And that's sort of harking back to Dan John. I remember reading an article by him where it's like every workout, go into the gym. And this was like how to improve your front squat or something along those lines. Go in, do 2 reps, 2 sets of 2, 80% every day on your front squat. Every session. I think it was clear to point that out. Every session, go in and do that, and then see where your front squat is after 2 weeks, because that acute training spike might be enough to move the needle. And again, with the EDM stuff, we'll use that in season as well, because that way the athletes can moderate. So with the golfers, for instance, if they're in season, they'll land at a tournament, and then quite often either Monday or Tuesday they'll EDM sort of KPI lift for low body, trap bar dead, something like that. Trap bar dead's great because obviously very little eccentric stress. They can load up, pull a heavy single, then do a couple of back offsets. They feel strong. They've honored the force part of the equation of their training, and then they can move on to all the more specific stuff. And that's where sort of EDM approach works really well. But you wouldn't use that with beginners. I remember when I was renting space at a CrossFit gym, I quite often tell guys not to come in and try and max out every day, because their competence isn't high enough. They haven't established high enough strength levels to warrant this sort of training approach. Their competence isn't high enough. Their technical aberration's too high. So every time they try and max out, it turns into an absolute shit show. But that's not really EDM. That's just shooting for a max randomly. You're not really honoring the rest of your training, and that was always kind of, I guess, part of the problem with CrossFit is it didn't really honor any long-term plan, at least for the guys doing it recreationally. Whereas now, it's funny because I'm so well. what do you want to do today? You know, they go, well, we'll do EDM squat, we'll do EDM deadlift or bench, you know, but because these guys have stuck to it for a while, they're competent. I have confidence in them. They have confidence in themselves. They can do it, you know, and this is where, you know, what's the saying? Don't do as I say, not what as I do, or whatever it is. Okay,
do as I say, not as I do.
Not what I do. Yeah. So, you know, and with beginners, that's more important. Whereas, you know, when guys get more advanced, then they can start to play. You know, they can start to explore a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, it's probably again a lot similar to a lot of your work I've read in terms of your everyday maximum. So I've been using, well, when I'm training for a meet, something I'll do is a single at RPE8. So a single, but really you could have done it for 3. And I find that just across a training block and how you've described in terms of percentage drop-offs, that's literally how I've been training for probably the last, well, certainly the years that I've been competing in powerlifting. And it's been making me think about where the adaptation is actually coming from. So as an example, when I go back into the gym, when gyms do reopen, I'll have a block of GPP work undoubtedly. And then when I transition into a strength block, I'll be hitting those everyday maximums. And then I'll be thinking, right, when that's trending upwards, let's say over 4 weeks or whatever, is it because I'm producing more force, or is it just because I'm becoming more skilled at lifting at that high percentage? Again, just to go off on a bit of a tangent, I think this a lot when you see case studies presented where you take a beginner and I don't know, they squat 80 kilos or whatever it is. And then 12 weeks later, they squat, I don't know, 100. And it's like, oh, they're stronger. And you're like, well, yeah, are they producing more force or are they just more skilled at the lift? Because if the aim of the lifting is to improve force production and all we've done is get more skilled at the lift, then have we improved force production, or we just, you know, it's sort of like, go on.
There's one intangible there that you've got to account for, and this is something I'm very, very big on, particularly very, very recently. And there's a section devoted to it in the Big Hitters Manual, and I've done a few posts talking about the concept, because it's a concept I'm still trying to unpick, which is the concept of intent. And it's for a lot of people, you know, perhaps in the case of that lifter who started at 80 and finished at 100, a big part of that might be their relationship with their confidence and intent in the way they approach the lift. And this is why some of the gains we see in golf with the club head speed come from intent. And well, what do we mean by intent? It's the effort you put into something, yes, but there's more involved in intent than that. And this is something I'm still trying to work on. I'm trying to find a working model for what I mean by intent. And it's the effort you put into something, sure, but there's a lot of intangibles there. Your confidence, your technical competency, the psychosocial factors of the environment as well, because sometimes you can find more intent in certain environments than you can in others. You know, can you get into a flow state easy enough? You know, and things like that. And you know, for instance, you have a situation, I felt this personally, where this is where my training's kind of changed as I've gotten older. I used to listen to you know, sort of loud metal music and would drink the triple espresso, and I'd step up to the bar and my intent would evaporate. I go to lift it and it would be an absolute grind, a shit show. And it's like, well, I've overshot here. This is I've not found that optimum sort of state of centeredness where I need to be to give this my best. So now, you know, I'm you know, skipping the triple espresso. I'm listening to lo-fi hip hop, and I'm getting into a sort of funner, sort of more contemplative state for lifting than I am, you know, than I was in the past, and everything just sort of feels smoother, you know. And I think this is again where sort of the theory of intent and the way you approach each workout, and we can measure intent to some extent with velocity based measures, and we can then try, and this has been measured, we've seen it where we've had guys you know, measure their velocity on the bar, get them to lift again, but focus on lifting it as fast as they can. Go in with the effort that you've got to go in, and you're going to lift this as fast as you can this time. You're going to beat the numbers you threw up last time on your velocity measures. And it gets better. And we've seen small interventions where they're basically, I guess this is part of the coach, where they've gone in, they've emphasized intent on every single set and every single workout. and everything is that much better. The outcomes are better rather than the people who did it with no sort of intent-based focus. And it's partly psychological, it's partly physiological, and this is why it's nebulous and relativistic. It's hard to unpick, you know. So this is sort of part of the equation too to all of this. And that's why I like the EDM method, to loop back around to where we were talking about, is because if you set it up right and do it well, it teaches you intent, because all you've got to do is got to go in there and just lift it once, right? Something heavy once, just go and do it. And then those back off sets feel super breezy as a result, you know. Whereas I've done programs before that have demanded percentage of a maximum sort of at 90 kilos plus, and there's that well, I've got to get the double, I've got to get the 2 sets of 2 or the 3 sets of 3 or the 3 sets of 2 or whatever. But building to this point, you go out and you go for it, and it stinks, you know, because you're trying to honor a long-term plan that's perhaps just a little bit too long and isn't willing to adapt around your present circumstances. And this is where, you know, going back to Mladen Jovanovic's thinking with the agile periodized approach, is that you have that pliability in your training that can adapt to the present state you find yourself in. And that's where obviously EDM is great for that, because, you know how you feel. But again, it requires a minimum competency. You know, for beginners, you know, they need structure, they need order, and they will do for the first maybe year or two of training. But then once they're competent, they don't need that anymore.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for the psychology of programming for beginners, in the sense of you'll write like an exact number. It's, I don't know, someone's barbell squatting like 20 kilos, and it's like, oh, last week I did 17 and a half, and you're like, it really doesn't matter, because you're so weak and you're so unaccustomed to the stimulus. But I also like with the EDM stuff, because I'm a massive overthinker when it comes to my own training, which is why I love it when my powerlifting coach writes me a program. But with that EDM, I'm like, oh, well, if last week, I don't know, I did X amount of weight, and I'm like, oh, do I feel like I'm this good, or do I feel like I'm, and you're like, you probably feel roughly around the same, but now you're like, right, I've got a number to shoot for. So even if I go 2.5 kilos more with the same effort level, psychologically, that feels great. And even if I don't feel great, it's like, well, the load on the bar it is determining the adaptation, but it isn't. It's like, well, how heavy it feels is what's ultimately going to determine it. And psychologically, that's quite refreshing compared to, as you said, right, I've got to hit 2 doubles at this number, otherwise this session's a waste of time.
Yeah, and I've come out of sessions before. I think this was part of the reason why when I tried Westside, for instance, I found it such hard work, because some days when you're doing that max effort method, and I'm trying to hit 3 PBs on a novel rotation of a lift, and my heart's not in it. I can't do it, and it burned me out super fast. You know, but yeah, it was just that trying to push the envelope every single time, even if the lift's different, you know, and but it's just such hard work, and yeah, that approach personally was not particularly good for me.
Well, it's funny because just hearing you talk there about novel exercise rotations, and going back to what we were chatting earlier on about in terms of having periods of structured training and periods of unstructured training, the amount of times where, for example, at the moment, I've got a 36 kilo kettlebell, some odds and sods weights that I can shove in a backpack, and I'm just practicing skater squats. I'm like, oh, that's a skater squat PB. I mean, I've only really trained it for 3 weeks, but we'll take everything we can get.
Exactly.
And just cycling back to the ballistic work we were talking about.
Sure.
Are there going to be any massive differences between the kind of ballistic work you're going to have for a golfer versus an MMA guy, or is it just all, we'll start extensive and move towards intensive?
Yeah, so we honor the extensive to intensive relationship, and the other heuristic I use is the heavier the med ball we use, the less specific the throw is going to look. So we'll use like lobs and tosses with heavier med balls, but then as we get to lighter med balls, we'll switch to the throw. And when it comes to the difference between combat athletes and golfers, the difference is the relationship of their hips to the direction of the vector, or the force vector of the throw, basically. So if you've got a golfer, they are always going to be throwing laterally, whereas with the MMA athlete, at least the final part of the throw will be in the sagittal plane. Because if you think about the relationship to the sport, golfers always are going to be striking laterally, Whereas an MMA fighter, yes, it's quasi-lateral, but it's always going to be, the hips will be facing the direction of the hand, if you understand what I'm saying. Yeah. So, and you have to honor that when it comes to doing your sort of high speed, highly specific med ball work. So, the hips are going to be more square for the MMA athlete. And you can see this, for instance, in some of the peaking work. I think there was a series of videos I did with Corey McKenna showing some contrast throwing and striking. And you've got, the relationship of the hips is always square to the direction of travel of the med ball. Not completely square, but sort of pretty square. Whereas golfers are always going to be, it's going to be separation of the shoulder and then back to center again. And that's the relationship between the two things is slightly different. And you just have to honor that when it comes to peaking.
And in terms of, I think I might have asked this earlier, but in terms of measuring the ability to separate hips from shoulders, how do you do any of that with your golfers?
Yeah. So we it's part of our general assessment is the ability to separate, and that's a simple either standing or sitting test. And then we just measure degrees of separation. And some athletes are great at creating separation, and it bleeds into their swing style. Other athletes perhaps aren't so good, or the coach identifies, and this is where talking to the golf coach is important, or the athlete themselves identify a lack of separation as an issue. You can try and work on that as best you can, but obviously different people have different tolerances in terms of the amount of torque they can handle through the spine. And we can help with that because obviously you're going to get a lot more rotation out of the thoracic spine. So a lot of our assessments, particularly the ones we use with golfers, are all around the T-spine. The physios at our gym have a really good system of like looking at T-spine mobility and checking that through thoroughly to make sure there's nothing kind of getting in the way. And so, if you start then teach them to separate their T-spine well, so that's why we do a lot of what we call lateral swings, where we'll get people into a hinge position and then get them to rotate into the same side supporting leg. And then we try and work on building that rotation and building strength in that position. Because you got to remember that the golf swing, it's not just like standing up straight and rotating, right? These guys are in a quasi hinge position. So, can they push their hip back? Can they get into a sort of quasi hinge position and then also rotate at the same time? Which is with MMA, the difference is obviously they're far more upright. They're not in a hinge position. They're in a sort of staggered stance position. So you need to check their rotation specific to the positions they'll find themselves in the sport, right? Now, don't get me wrong, in MMA, you don't need a ton of T-spine rotation. In fact, too much can be bad, because you want them to be able to generate decent force. Whereas if they're over rotating their punches, then that can also be an issue in golf and in MMA. Sorry. So if they're over rotating.
And you mentioned, for example, golf being a quasi hinge, and you mentioned a sort of staggered stance style deadlift just now and earlier on. In chatting off air with you, you mentioned your hinge manual, and I just asked whether it was a series of progressions, which not to say it's been done to death, but it probably has been in S&C circles. But what is your hinge manual bringing, or why do you feel the need to put it out there, and what do you think it brings that you haven't seen elsewhere?
Yeah, so it's something I'm working on with Alex Krzyzewski, who is one of the physios at our facility. And basically, we realized that the hinge is probably one of the most, it's probably more neglected in favor of the squat, particularly in athletic populations, because the focus is always on squatting, either unilateral or bilateral squatting. And then there's the big issue around, for sports performance, around hamstring injuries and the nature of hamstring injuries and how they come about. And we're of the opinion that you need both distal and proximal hamstring strength. So you do your knee flexion based work, you do your hip extension based work, and work on those to develop really, really strong bulletproof posterior chain. And it's about both marrying that, how to teach the hinge as a pattern, because occasionally you get people, and as a coach, teaching the squat's always easy. Most of the time you can get people to figure out the squat, usually a simple implementation of some sort of external support or hand hold. So for instance, you can get most people to squat if they hold onto something in front of themselves, very, very basic. or if you prop the heels up to make up for lack of dorsiflexion, you can usually, within a session, get someone squatting in some fashion. When you get someone in who is hinge adverse or hingeless, as we call them, they don't know how to do it. I've seen sort of intermediate and amateur coaches absolutely fall apart when they can't teach someone how to hinge, because most people, they just flop through their lumbar or through their T-spine. They'll just fold over because they don't understand how to push the hips back, how to move themselves. And a lot of it comes with what the head is doing. And this is something else we talk about in the Hinge manual, is that basically, you know, if the head goes forward, the hips go back. If the head goes back, the hips come forward. And a lot of people don't have this relationship from foot to hip to head and how they coordinate. And you know, you give someone a dowel and tell them to do a proper hinge or an RDL type pattern, and most of the time you'll see them just, you know, drop their head down low and their T-spine folds, and they can't do it. And I've seen coaches fall apart when the hinge pattern just isn't, they get a newbie in and the hinge pattern just isn't happening. So you have to then sort of constrain them and try and find means to try and get them in a position where they're going to keep their torso completely straight and learn how to push the hips backwards, keeping that sort of slight knee bend. And this is the other thing with you know, the hinge pattern is like, how much knee bend am I allowed to do? You know, where are my hips going? Where's my torso going? And it's like, basically, what is a hinge? What is not a hinge? And then looking at basically where we can apply very heavy hinging as a driver of athletic performance. And if you look at a lot of athletic movements, again, the focus has been on the squat, but you know, we pay lip service to how big a driver of movement the glutes are and the hips are. Brett Contreras, you know, led us all down the garden path when it came to hip thrusts, because he was trying to carve out a niche, and people were hammering hip thrusts, but they weren't seeing a lot of the positive change. And obviously, we had those evidence come out suggesting that hip thrusts weren't the one for improving horizontal force production, right? The vector theory and all that turned out to not be what we thought it was. And then there was a great study that showed that pretty much from an EMG standpoint, Romanian deadlifts and hip thrusts aren't really very different to each other. So I've been RDLing all along and have gone, I'm not really buying the hip thrust. In fact, some of my guys complained that the hip thrust was hurting their backs, and we try and set it up in all sorts of fashions. The only thing that seemed to work super well was a very, very heavy banded hip thrust. But the barbell hip thrust, some guys could do 600-700 pounds, 300 kilo hip thrust, and I'd have other guys who were, you know, super strong on other lifts. They do the hip thrust and they could, you know, they complain their backs hurt or their hips hurt or whatever. And this is utterly perplexing me. So we buried down on the Romanian deadlift and basically tried to get as many of our guys to master heavy Romanian deadlifting as much as possible. And, you know, touch wood, none of the athletes I've worked with, you know, including our rugby guys, you know, we've never really had a serious hamstring issue. And I'm of the opinion, particularly with supramaximal eccentrics, we can probably get some fascicle length change as well in the hamstring. And, you know, supramaximal RDLs aren't easy. You need to be good at Romanian deadlifts to do them. But basically, you know, you're walking out in excess of your Romanian deadlift or even deadlift maximum, and you're basically, you know, pushing your hips back and trying to ride that down to catches, you know, usually just below your knee. And I tell you what, your hamstrings and glutes afterwards, there's nothing quite like it. I've never had, personally, because I like to test everything I'm putting forward, I've never had glute and hamstring DOMs like that before in my life. And I've done hip thrust, I've done conventional RDLs, I've done all this type of stuff. And yeah, it was absolutely unreal. And I'm of the opinion, you know, that if you bury down deep enough in the RDL, there's some diamonds to find there. But unfortunately, the research at the moment isn't really honoring it, because there's two problems with Romanian deadlift research. It's generally not heavy enough, and there's generally not enough competence in the practitioners performing the Romanian deadlift. They're not good enough at Romanian deadlifts, because there's an optimum point at which you want your knees bent enough that it's not totally hamstring dominant, but you don't want your knee so bent that your hamstring slacken. And this is where a lot of people get unstuck, is they generally too much knee bend and there's too much slack in the hamstring. So you've got to find a sweet spot in between the two where your knees are, and that takes time. And the other problem is it takes feel. And teaching that feel to people is really, really difficult. And obviously with the Hinge manual, this is something we're going to try and discuss and talk about, is like, looking for that feel. But then once you get competent at the Romanian deadlift, it opens up so much other stuff to you. I love trap bar Romanian deadlifts. I love, staggered Romanian deadlifts. Zercher good mornings, which are technically a Romanian deadlift variant if done properly. And it just opens up to a lot of different potential hinge movements for you if you get very, very good at the Romanian deadlift. Again, another variant, snatch foot Romanian deadlift is another great choice, and it opens up a lot of options. And I'm of the opinion that if you're combining heavy RDLs, if you want to do your Nordics, if you want to do your direct hamstring work, you're going to be in a position where, the hamstrings are going to be, super strong, hopefully able to tolerate the training you're doing. And the only criticism I've had is I've known guys, particularly sprint coaches, who've gone, oh, we tried heavy RDLs and the guys were pulling up saying their hamstrings felt tight. And it's like, well, yeah, you don't do your heaviest RDL work at the same time you're trying to do your max velocity work. You're trying to honor two things at once. That's not going to work. If you can do like lower intensity sprint work during a very intensive RDL period, don't put the two things together at once. You're asking too much of the hamstrings, but I feel if you were to set up your training properly, you could get a lot out of Romanian deadlifts.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of, sorry, just coming back to the whole hinge thing, which I was talking about. So yeah.
No, it's a nice point. And it's funny because when I used to work at an all-girls school, I basically would use a combination of the hip thrust, but we would literally do various different constraints-based hinge patterns, because I was like, right, we can get you pretty strong pretty quickly on the hip thrust in terms of a low barrier to entry. But then I still think the skill of being able to hinge ultimately is going to get you further down the line than whatever we can load up on a hip thrust. And also, in my mind, I kind of wrestled with the fact, I was like, right, if you can't competently hinge, but we're loading up a hip thrust, I'm like, is that basically adding a match to the gasoline?
Well, the thing is, the hinge or the RDL pays respect to your relationship with the floor in a fashion that's, I'm guessing, more sport specific, because you're kind of pulling the ground, and there's some great actualization exercises involving like prime times, so straight legged bounds, single leg RDL hops, stuff I've taken from sprint coaches. Combine that with the heavy RDL, and you're in a really good position. I'm of the opinion, because you got to remember the RDL basically is actioning, almost dragging against the ground with the foot. If you bury your toe into the floor as you pull on the RDL, you're almost gripping the floor, and just honoring that relationship. So you're vertical as well, which is important. Whereas I feel that obviously with the hip thrust, the relationship with the ground is never really addressed, because you're either on your heels, you might be flat footed, but you're not really putting a ton of force into the floor. So it varies. And then obviously the loading you have to get a lot out of the hip thrust was always, I've seen videos of fitness chicks doing hip thrusts with like 500 pounds plus. And it's like, well, what does that say about the movement? And, that people how many people do you see 500-pound RDLs?
And again, just to emphasize the point, I had like girls at like school whose only exposure to strength training was the exposure that I'd given them, hip thrusting like 140 for 8 at like, I don't know, 65-ish kilos body weight. And I'm like, if I put double your body weight on your back for a squat or on the trap bar, it's not moving. And you're like, right, am I really? And it goes back to, what are you measuring and what you think you're measuring? Is that, are you actually getting more robust from the hip thrust, or is it just masking over some other fragilities, should we say?
Well, the thing is, the hip thrust doesn't really respect eccentric lengthening of the hamstring, does it? You're not going to get the same eccentric stress that you can get with a Romanian deadlift. And I think that's the beauty of the RDL, is that it's a triphasic movement in its nature, and you can train all three parts of the eccentric, isometric, and concentric element. Whereas I guess with heavy hip thrusts, quite often, because the bars are resetting to the floor every time, you're stealing away that isometric. Don't get me wrong, you can do hip thrusts where you don't put the bar down, but most people are resetting every time and then jamming their hips into that thing, and you're not really getting good triphasic stimulus from it, because of the different interpretations of the hip thrust.
And it's kind of the way I think about pressing work for athletes, in the sense of, for example, if you take a traditional overhead press, once I've locked that out, I'm pretty much going to let it crash on me. I'm not going to lock it out and then tempo it down. And again, going back to hip thrusts, if you're loading it heavy enough to get, I suppose, what you would call a strength adaptation, then you're probably just naturally going to let it crash on you a little bit, even with all the will in the world not to do that. As soon as it gets above a certain weight, you're probably going to do it without even realizing.
So what happens is, I guess, is it becomes a means of expressing force rather than training it, which is my issue with very, very high handled trap bar deads, is because you see a lot of people, I deadlift 600 pounds. You see this, with the Rogue trap bar, which has handles kind of mid thigh, I think. And I've roasted a few S&C guys for posting videos of them doing 600-pound trap bar dead. So those handles are above your knees, mate. That's and it's just output. All you're showing is high levels of force expression. You're not really training high levels of force expression. I love trap bar deads. Don't get me wrong. I've written articles about them, and I think it's terrific. But there's a point at which it goes from being a good way of getting quality output repeatedly to just being a means of showing high levels of force expression, like a rack pull or something,
Yeah, I think that's a great point as well. I remember listening to a podcast a while back and saying this is the problem with social media, is that you see the expression of a skill or a quality, but you don't see what it took to develop it. Like I always make the argument that the stuff I've posted from my own powerlifting, the most part of my training has been, as Dan John would say, punch the clock workouts, nothing to write home about, nothing that's going to get likes on Instagram. But then you pull like triple body weight and it's like, oh, how did you get there? It's like, yeah, do this 4 or 5 times a week for 5-6 years. And yeah, come talk to me.
Nobody's interested in that. Nobody cares about that.
No.
It's all about the show. It's all about the circus of fitness, as opposed to the sort of, the hands-on work, the behind the scenes stuff. It's not eye-catching. People aren't interested in it. And then you get people, what they do is they'll engage in audience capture, and they'll, like a great example, and don't get me wrong, I call them fitness clowns. And I kind of mean that in the nicest sense. A great example is Juji Mufu, whatever his name is.
Brilliant example.
And the point is, he knows, because he knows what he's doing. He knows exactly what he's doing. And basically his what he does is basically he's just sort of expressing strength in novel fashion to garner much attention as possible, right? So he's always doing a wacky thing every other week. And this is partly audience capture, because obviously you do something goofy or strange and it gets a lot of views. And you're like, well, this stuff seems to gain traction. If I do more of this stuff, I'll get even more traction. And so any positive health or fitness message has been thrown out the window. And it's just, what goofy thing is Juji Mufu doing this week? And this is, particularly female fitness personalities and some of the male ones, they just start engaging in audience capture, and it's all about getting views. There's no message, there's no cogent strategy. The only strategy is get more views, right? Yeah. So there's no message. And these guys say, oh, I'm inspirational, I'm motivational. It's like, well, there's no real content to what you're doing. It's a sideshow. It's all about views. And what happens is the message is lost. The message just becomes, here's my latest and greatest trick, as opposed to, here's how I think you can better yourself, and this is a big problem we're seeing at the moment with social media and fitness and strength and conditioning. Joel Seedman's a great example of a guy engaging in, and it's not tinkering. There's a difference. Tinkering, you can see you can kind of see the strategy and progression in the thinking of what someone's doing as they develop novel approaches. A good example is Tony Ricky, who works with a lot of MMA guys. If you were to take a look on his Instagram initially, you go, bloody hell, this is a load of weird horizontal force production stuff that just looks goofy. But if you go back through his posts, you can see actually he's approached this point in an iterated fashion. You go to Joel Seedman's Instagram, and there's no iteration there. It's what's the wacky exercise of the day, you know? And because it's novel, and because he's engaging in audience capture, he knows that he has to put up something novel and different every single time, because you've got to outdo yourself, right? And it becomes an ever accelerating upward game. There's no cogent message. There's nothing real, no real theoretical backing. Kierwen and Flat exposed him for that. You know, and there's no coherence. There's no strategy there, and people are going to probably have issue with me saying this stuff, but this is what I'm seeing. But not a lot of people are talking about it. I know we've gone way off topic for what we were intending to talk about today, but you know, I think it's important, and more strength coaches and more people in fitness need to have these conversations about what's happening on social media. And I've done a few posts about this, what I'm seeing, you know, and it's at the end of the day, you know, it's people playing games and engaging in audience capture and strategies to try and maximize a following, as opposed to put out anything progressive or meaningful in terms of improving the industry or improving people's lives.
I think it's so difficult to tread that line. Like, for example, Stephen Jones, who I had on the podcast, like, for me, he's sort of right on the line of some of this stuff that's super, super interesting. And when you talk to him, you're like, wow, there is some real well thought out methodology here. But it's so easy to look at certain stuff and think, where on earth does this come from? Like, Juju Mufu goes back to what we were saying. Ridiculously strong guy. I mean, I'm not going to lie, I've seen his videos of, like, he'll put on like a safety bar and like mow the lawn with 200 kilos on his back. And you're just like, you know, hopefully someone watches that and thinks, Jesus, this guy has obviously done some boring stuff to do entertaining stuff. But it's such a fascinating discussion, because, you know, it's difficult to question people's not motives, that's the wrong word, but, you know, in theory, more people, let's say, I don't know, 1 million people watch that video, and then, I don't know, 500,000 people watch him, I don't know, talk about safety bar squats, and then even less listen to him talk about how to teach a squat. But again, even going slightly off topic further, when you're saying about your Hinge manual, the analogy I would use when trying to, or where I found myself in trying to teach the Hinge sometimes, is like, if you've ever gone to a restaurant and, I don't know, one of the table legs isn't quite sitting right, so your table's sort of rocking back and forth. So you ask the waiter if they can sort it out, and I don't know, they put like a beer mat or whatever underneath the table, and you're like, oh, great, fixed it. Oh, but now it's rocking on the other side. Like, it's so easy to think, right, I'll try this constraint. Okay, I've fixed the, I don't know, the spine being neutral. Oh, great, now they're bending their knees too much. And, you know, you almost end up going around in circles. But that's the kind of stuff you don't see on social media, because nobody wants to say, hey, I spent 45 minutes of an hour session trying to teach someone a hinge pattern, and they didn't leave the session feeling out of breath, and they probably didn't understand the importance of what we were doing.
This is the important thing, is that we don't learn in a linear fashion, and we learn via convexity. So things like taking risks, tinkering, and iterating are really important. You can see that Stephen Jones's approach, you know, yes, he's trying to sell you something, but it's iterated. You can see that he's a process there, and he outlines it. You know, you see him constantly reposting the fact that all this specificity work you see is built on a pyramid of general preparation. It's not like he's not doing that stuff. He is. He's told me himself. You know, it's the fact that you're seeing the end expression of what it is he's trying to achieve. It's just people, you know, and golf is guilty of this, of trying to skip to that part right away. You know, but he's definitely thought about it long and hard, and you know, there's good rationale behind what he's doing. You know, I'm perhaps more conservative. I'm more of a meat and potatoes strength and conditioning coach, but I would dabble in that stuff when I feel that the athletes are in the right place there. And you'll see some of my specific golf work, you know, but it does look very like golf. We're using things like overspeed devices, specific med ball work, that type of stuff. But, you know, I'm very keen not to get engaged in the game of putting all that stuff first and foremost and making it all I'm about. I'm keen on showing that, look, there's the base of work that sits at the bottom of that pyramid, you know, because my overall message is still, you need decent levels of general preparation before you start engaging in specific preparation. You know, and it's just, yeah, not to get caught up in audience capture like a Joel Seedman or someone like that, who's basically, it's just, you know, the next zany, wacky thing every other week. And yeah, like the show your tinkering, basically, is you could be the quote there, is show your tinkering, show that you're experimenting, show that you're playing around with ideas. You know, but you have to be able to rationalize and explain yourself, you know, and that's the one thing I guess nobody's willing to do anymore, is nobody, you know, I guess it's a problem with sort of a slightly relativistic age we live in, is that, you know, years ago, a teacher, you're trying to solve a math problem and your teacher goes, show your work. And you have to sit there and you know, show them how you got to the answer. Whereas now people are unwilling to ask that question, is right, show us how you got here. What's your line of thinking? What's your strategy? And it's, you know, again, because we live in an age where people are very unwilling to make any real value judgment. You know, your program's bad, your program's good, this program's bad, this program's no good. And I've, again, something I've spoken about is this relativistic notion of like all roads lead to Rome. I hate that phrase. Strength and conditioning coaches say that phrase, and I say, no, it's not all roads lead to Rome. That's a get out of jail free card. If your method sucks, your method sucks, and you need to be able to demonstrate objectively that it doesn't. You know, the onus is on you to be able to demonstrate that your approach works as best as you can. You know, whereas you know, again, going back to the Seedman debate with Keir, he started pulling out N1 answers and very relativistic answers, appeals to authority, you know, and again, people are afraid to have this type of discussion because, again, there's this sort of relativistic notion that there's an equalness to all answers, and that's not true. Sport fundamentally is not very egalitarian. There's winners and losers, and, you know, hopefully the best methods and the best approaches do propagate to the top.
And just in listening to you speak there, it reminds me of another guest I've had on the show, the Mindful Mover, and one of the things he calls out within the strength and conditioning industry, which, again, I think because it's sort of unheard of to speak negatively or I think constructively about another person's work, is he says it's a complete cop-out to say that there are no bad exercises, you know, and every exercise might have a place depending on the context. And again, not to call out Joel Seedman, but that's the main issue I have, having never spoken to him. Again, I'll say that on air, is that I can't see the thinking behind why you would combine this movement with this movement with this movement, and why that's somehow superior to overloading the qualities that those individual movements would give you. And that's my issue with it. Again, maybe if I spoke to him, he would be able to say, oh, well, actually, here's the thinking behind it. And as an example, I know Stefan, from having spoken to him personally and listened to him on other podcasts, he said, look, there's only so many videos of squat, hinge, push, pull that I can do. And he'll probably say that he's not only meeting his audience where he's at, but he's like, my social media does not reflect every single thing that I do in my training. But that's the issue I have with Joel Seedman stuff, in that I can't work out the decision-making process that led you to think that that was the best exercise. I mean, even going back to your all roads lead to Rome, it also reminds me of when strength and conditioning coaches or techs talk about cutting out stuff that doesn't improve performance. And I'm like, why are we even having that discussion? Why does it make it into the program if it doesn't? Like, why would you be like, it's kind of like what I call exercise FOMO. It's like, we'll put it in there just in case that is the difference maker. But it's like the TPI screens and hitting the ball, you know, with a greater club speed. It's like, I don't think that's the missing piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it's the insidious sort of marginal gains type thinking that occurred. You know, whereas most people actually don't need to focus on marginal gains; they need to focus on their maximal gains. And this is a mistake a lot of folks are making and still making, is that you know, what can I maximize? You know, whereas people, what they're doing is they're looking around the periphery, you know, for quick easy answers, for short, you know, easy solutions to problems. And you know, again, what people need to focus on is you know, maximal issues. You know, what's the fundamentals of the stuff I need to get better at. And I guess the difference is, the thing is, you know, what we need more of is pragmatism. You know, and this is something I've spoken about an awful lot as well, is you know, you need to be able to have your methods come in contact with the real world, make objective decisions about them and decide whether to keep them or to let them go. However, if you're ideologically possessed, that's not going to happen. You're going to try and do everything in your power to prove that your methods work, even using N1 situations or how many followers you happen to have, but we've seen this in research, people going out of their way to design research studies that positively favor the outcomes people desire. That's not science, that's ideological possession. And to say it doesn't happen in strength and conditioning, you'd be a fool. We know that it does happen, and that there are certain studies that definitely do bias, favorable outcomes for what the researcher wants, not what the science really should say.
Yeah, and again, I don't know why my brain's going off on this tangent, but it just in one of your articles I was reading when it was talking about the no true Scotsman fallacy, and I was like, that's a classic example of if somebody's argument doesn't suit my belief system, then their argument doesn't count.
Yeah, and that's it. You're just dispensing with criticism, basically. It's like, and this is again a modern problem, is that people aren't willing to we don't know how to take criticism on board, but this is why I'm of the opinion that being pragmatic, having pragmatic ideal, and tinkering and being willing to toss away, because people learn best on their own, right? And willing to toss away things that you were wrong about. Having that willingness, and perhaps having a small circle of friends you can bounce ideas off, not random people on Twitter. You won't listen to them, because everything's sort of geared towards hostility. But have a group of people to be intellectually honest, and have them bounce your ideas off. So if you've come up with something that doesn't perhaps work, you can go, no, I don't think this. What do you think? Do you think this is what juice is worth the squeeze? And they can give you an honest response. The other, you just got to risk not building an echo chamber. But what happens is a lot of these guys who perhaps perhaps aren't being fully honest about their ideas do build echo chambers, because it's comforting to know that someone at least agrees with what you're saying. And that's a natural proclivity that we just got to be which is why some of Stephen Jones's stuff, for instance, has me scratching my head, and I could easily just go, well, I'm going to unfollow him. I can't bother to think about what it is he's trying to do. On the other hand, you've got other strength coaches, Alan Bishop's a good example, who uses a lot of Poliquin methods, very meat and potatoes strength and conditioning approach. And I follow a lot of old school powerlifters. Like I was following a program by James Smith for a while, guys like that who implement West Side methods, so I try and balance the curmudgeonly old school sort of meat and potatoes S&C guys with some of the more avant-garde thinkers, and try and see what comes out. And sometimes it does sit uncomfortably with you, but you've got to just bear that out, because I guess what it suggests is there maybe something I'm not doing right, and you've got to be able to handle that information. And I think that's where a lot of people come unstuck, is because they can't bear to the idea that perhaps they may be missing something here, or they're not doing something right. What you end up doing is, I guess, creating a feed that just basically comforts you, which is something you can't do. Which is why I follow sometimes people that annoy me, because occasionally there's something they might be saying that could be true. I think it's the old. I think it was a Jordan Peterson quote, something along the lines of an enemy at least be honest, whereas a friend might well lie to your face. And yeah, there are guys that annoy the hell out of me that I do follow, but occasionally there might be something in what they're saying that I could glean something from, or at least bolster my own arguments against what they're saying.
That's exactly what I was just thinking of. A friend of mine who's, for me, a very high-level boxing coach, and has worked with some high-level people, but doubts his own ability. He's talking about setting up a YouTube channel or a podcast. And he's like, what if people don't agree with what I'm putting out there? And I said, well, that's going to do two things. Either one, it'll teach you something. You'll be like, oh, actually, they've got something that I've not got. I like the sound of that. Or two, you'll be like, no, I disagree with them. That further strengthens what I believe in. Just cycling back to a question I had earlier. So with how important the strength metrics and the power metrics are for golf, then you wrote in one of your articles about, should we just turn to powerlifting then? So my question is, what should, for example, golf athletes, MMA athletes take from powerlifting? We mentioned a couple with the everyday maxims and stuff like that. And what should they avoid taking from powerlifting?
So obviously the biggest thing is powerlifting to some extent is Lindy, right? So it has some stuff that has worked for a long time and will continue to work. We know that deadlifting, squatting, and bench pressing are useful. However, not everyone is made to deadlift, squat, or bench press. So what you need to do as a coach is be able to serve up derivations of those movements that work for the individual in front of you. So for instance, you might have an athlete who, for whatever reason, cannot back squat, but they might be able to do a derivation of a back squat. Can they front squat? Can they Zercher squat? Can they safety bar squat? They're still performing a squat pattern, but it's not, they're not constrained by the notion of the strength sport. And this is a big thing I talk about, is that a lot of people, when I started posting like the supramaximal hand supported squat and the supramaximal hand supported split squat, people from strict conventional lifting sort of disciplines were like, that's cheating. It's like, at the end of the day, we're not competing in the hand supported split squat. I'm trying to apply stimulus to that individual that then positively transfers to the sport. Just because you feel that somebody doing a hand supported squat or a hand supported split squat is cheating, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do is apply systemic stress to the individual to elicit adaptation. They're not going to be competing in hand supported split squat against anybody. You've got to get out of your head that the idea is maximum load lifted on 3 very specific lifts. That's 3 specific expressions of strength. You can't be hung up on them being the be all and end all, And don't get me wrong, I've got guys who hand support split squat and can also, double body weight, so they can cover those 2 bases. The 2 things do have a relationship, but it's just getting, divorcing yourself from the strictures of strength sports is the biggest thing for a lot of these guys, particularly guys who've moved into strength and conditioning and have a powerlifting background. They have to learn to let go. Particularly, same thing for Olympic weightlifting. Not everybody else is going to be able to Olympic weightlift. You got guys who are die hard. My athletes, power clean, they snatch, they power snatch. And, however, we can build powerful athletes without those lifts. In the UK, we're particularly guilty of hanging out on the Olympic lifts because of the UK SDA, because they're obsession with the Olympic lifts as part of their approach. You can do just as good a work with squat jumps or trap bar jumps in terms of eliciting power gains in the low body. We've got the evidence to suggest that. And it's just not being so doggishly tied to very specific expressions of strength, and learning to embrace other expressions of strength. Because at the end of the day, total force production, however you measure it, we can still step everybody up onto a mid-thigh pull or onto a squat force platform test. And as long as those numbers are budging, however you're doing that, that's all that matters, right?
Yeah, and that's why I particularly like your work and Stefan's work, in the sense of, I see some of these supramaximal eccentrics with someone like a golf athlete, or I see Stefan doing highly specific work with cricket, young cricketers especially, and it perks my interest because I think, are you going too much down a rabbit hole, or is there something I'm missing that I don't understand? And that's what I particularly enjoy. Whereas, again, no disrespect to Joel Seedman, but sometimes I'll see stuff and I'll be like, I don't even understand how you've got into that quote unquote rabbit hole. And that's why I particularly enjoy your content, and that's why I particularly enjoyed diving deeper into it today. And just in wrapping up, so 4 questions left. If you had one key take home for the listeners, what would that take home be?
I guess, if you're a strength and conditioning coach and you're listening, I'll speak to strength and conditioning coaches. It's easier for me. Just be willing to perhaps get beyond things like sets and reps and exercises and start thinking about thinking, if that makes sense. So look at models of operating in the world. 2 that work particularly well for me are look into what the pragmatism as the pragmatic ideal, because as a strength coach, that'll serve you awfully well. The fact that you test your ideas, you measure your outcomes objectively, and you deal with the situation that's first and foremost in front of you, instead of perhaps trying to honor some long-term plan. Because taking a bottoms-up approach, particularly working with athletes, particularly working with young athletes, will serve you better than trying to hit certain milestones or lofty goals. You have to deal with the situation in front of you. And I think this speaks partly to sports science education, I guess, is that there's so much lip service towards, macro and long forms of periodized programming and planning, that when you're actually feet on the ground in the gym, face to face with the athletes, the situation can devolve or evolve rapidly. And a lot of people forget that. And then just the other thing is, I see a lot of young guys, quite burnt out with, especially at the moment, and with the lack of sort of purpose in terms of where they're trying to get to. And we get a lot of young guys in, and it's like, well, what do you want to be a strength coach? Okay, well, what does that look like? What's your 2, 3, 4, 5 year plan? What are you thinking going ahead? And just having a robustness, that it's not going to be a completely linear improvement in terms of your career trajectory. You're going to have to eat shit for a little while and just get used to that. Because a lot of guys I know who come out of, they do a master's or whatever, and they think that they'll be able to walk into an S&C job. It's not that easy. I came up in a time where there were barely any S&C jobs, and there still aren't that many at all. And it's that would be my advice, is just if you really want to do this, if you really, really want to be an S&C coach, it's going to suck, especially for the first 10 years. It's going to take a while, because nobody's going to roll over and let you in. You want a job with a premiership, they're not going to swing their doors open to you. You got 200-300 other people looking for the same job, which is part of the reason why I guess I did what I did, is because I'm not particularly big on authority. I don't like being told what to do. So working for myself works ideally, and then have the athletes come to me instead of it being the other way around. So yeah. I know I got off on a tangent again, but
no, that's the nature of my podcast. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's okay.
And you're welcome to use Joel Seaman as an answer for this one. But if you could observe one coach working with their athletes, who would you choose to observe and spend time with, and why?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me think. So I guess I'd like to get a look at the approach they take at the UFC PI. So I see some bits and pieces, and I'm not able to build a whole picture. The manual they put out is really good. So I'd like to spend a week or 2 weeks at the UFC PI and see their approach in action, from everything from assessment to how they actually implement interventions, and then how they go about sort of doing with that stuff, because they in my opinion represent the very sort of high end of MMA S&C interventions, as a gold standard in my mind. But that, in terms of intervention, they're not giving us an awful lot of information. So I'm there trying to sort of pick up the pieces and wonder what it is they're actually doing. That would probably be my biggest thing of interest for that, would be to take a good look at the UFC PR. I'm sure if I were to ask Duncan French if I can come visit, they're probably more than happy to let me.
Yeah, Duncan's a good guy. And I'm intrigued where you're going to go with this. But just one recommended resource, again, book, podcast, app, gym equipment, whatever.
Okay. So can I say 2?
Yeah, crack on.
Yeah, obviously Simply Faster. The guy who runs it, one of the guys who runs it, Carl Valley, it took a real chance on me as a few years ago, and I started writing content for them, and he's given me opportunity to get my message out to the S&C world, which has helped with my level of exposure, which is awfully good. And there's lots of different coaches writing for them, so you get a lot of diversification. It's not like you're getting a monoculture, which is important. I think that's really important, that you're not getting a particular sort of monoculture when it comes to dealing with S&C problems, and there's a real diversity of authors writing for them. The other thing would be with the one S&C book, I'm not sure if it's by me or around me. I normally have it on hand, but it doesn't seem to be next to me. Would be, oh no, here it is. Is handy sitting next to your bookshelf. Is Mladen Jovanović's book, the strength training manual. And this guy is a next level thinker when it comes to S&C. And people pay lip service to super training and Bomper and Zatorsky, all great books, stuff like that. But nobody's written a really compelling S&C book for me, in a long time. And Mladen's book, Strength Training Manual, the Agile Periodization Approach, is probably one of the best S&C books there is. And it's not because it's just, there's a lot of sets and reps at the back, which is terrific. But the first part deals with mental models and how to tackle problems, things like heuristics, ways of thinking, the establishing sort of meaning in your training approach and things like that people don't talk about. Whereas normally, everything starts with an anatomy and physiology section, right? You open up pretty much any S&C book, and I can, chapter 1 is anatomy and physiology. Whereas, Mladen's book opens up, I believe, and he talks about precision versus significance, and large and small world thinking, which is completely different, and a lot of, I guess, the kickback on this book is that he rails a little bit against this, the scientism that's very present in S&C at the moment is that we perhaps don't pay enough respect to things like pragmatism, to things like, real world or, in the trenches approaches to training, because everything puts science as an ideal. And don't get me wrong, science is a tool for explaining how things work. But when it becomes, a meaning of belief of how we approach solving our problems, we become unstuck, because we forget at the end of the day, the business of strength and conditioning or coaching is still serving people, and people are complicated. We can't reduce people down to mere numbers. And I think that's why I like this book.
I'm brains drawing a blank here, but I think can't remember whose quote it is, but it's something like, not everything that is measured matters, and not everything that does matter can be measured. And I think that's
there you go.
That's kind of what springs to mind listening to you say about that there. And finally, how can people reach out to you if they've got any questions based on what they've heard?
Sure. So I'm on Instagram at Powering Through, and you can reach me on Twitter at WS Wayland. Those are probably the two best places to reach me.
Awesome. And I'll put everything that we've mentioned in the show notes. So the Big Hitters manual, the Hinge manual when it comes out. The Simply Faster stuff, can't recommend enough. I mean, I dug through a load of those articles in preparation for this chat, which is great to actually have some context heading into it. Because as we said, with certain people, you just can't find out the decision-making process that led to the thoughts that you see in the snapshots on social media. But yeah, it's been awesome to chat, Will, and thank you very much for giving us so much of your time.
That's all right, no problem.